And for our third session, I'm delighted to introduce Helen Tovey, Wellbeing and Mind Hypnotherapy, who's going to be talking about tackling polar bears. So I certainly look forward to that one. Okay, over to you then, Helen. Thank you.
Brilliant. Thank you, Mark. And good morning, everybody. Oh, good afternoon if you happen to be overseas and not in the UK. So, yes, we've had a couple of really great sessions this morning, and you might have guessed that psychological stress has been on the increase. And there are studies that show that it has been increasing quite significantly over probably the last 20 or so years. And it doesn't just make us more anxious, irritable, and overwhelmed. It does actually have physical consequences for us as well, because it's been shown that it can be damaging to the cardiovascular system. It can be a major contributor to weight gain and even possibly type 2 diabetes and Alzheimer's. So, needless to say, we really do need to be finding ways that we can manage our stress because it's crucial, not just for our mental well-being, but for our physical health as well. Okay, so I'm going to get my page to advance, but I've got some other things open at the same time. Oh, sorry, I've lost my presentation now. Right, come back. Okay, this isn't working. Let me get rid of the chat. You won't believe I use Zoom all the time. I can't get it to work at the moment. Can you see my screen? Because I can't. Mark, can you see my
I
screen?
can see your screen. Yes, you're still on the first slide.
Oh,
Yeah.
okay, so it's not showing for me. This is going to be interesting. Okay, right. Oh, here we go. Okay, there we go. Right, there you go. That was a very stressful situation for me. Who knew? Okay, so what I'm going to cover, what happens when you meet a polar bear? Because you do it all the time. I'm going to look at how your brain works. So similar to what Hannah's just covered, but I explain things a little bit differently. And in the world of learning, repetition is always a good thing anyway. I'm going to talk about the concept of a stress bucket, which is, you may have come across that. I use it in quite a simple way, but very helpful. And then I want to go through some practical tips for reducing anxiety and getting the best out of yourself. And I'm going to give you some stuff that is additional to what Sue and Hannah have already covered. And I'm actually going to talk a little bit about how I work with clients as a hypnotherapist, because I do think there seems to be some mystery or mysticism around hypnotherapy and some misconceptions as well. So I'd like to blast those out of the water. But who am I to be talking about all of this? I actually have a background in IT as well, over 30 years. I started out sort of in various IT roles, and then I moved over into IT learning and development. And then a few years ago, as part of a voluntary redundancy program, I opted to take early retirement and I retrained as a life coach. And then I kind of went on a bit of an NLP journey. NLP is Neuro Linguistic Programming. And I basically qualified as an NLP master practitioner, which is kind of the highest level before you start becoming a trainer. And there's quite an overlap between that and hypnotherapy. And that was what then led me to retrain as a solution-focused hypnotherapist, excuse me, and to set up wellbeing in mind hypnotherapy. Okay, so what would happen if you met one of these? Now, I know it's not very likely unless one has just escaped from your local zoo, but go with me on this because you would very quickly notice a physiological response, some of what Hannah has already explained. So maybe your palms would become a little bit clammy, your heart would be racing, your stomach would be churning, your breath would become fast and shallow, and you would be straight into that stress response, that fight, flight, freeze. And in the case of a polar bear, I recommend fleeing as opposed to trying to stand your ground and fight or freeze. Top tip for you, I do recommend climbing the nearest big tree, because have you ever seen a polar bear up a tree? But this stress response is pretty instantaneous and it happens without any conscious thought from that thinking part of your brain. And that's just as well because you haven't got time to be thinking about it. So let's have a look at how this works in the brain. So we've got this polar bear. So information about the polar bear comes into our brain and it goes to a part called the thalamus, first of all. And the thalamus then directs that information in two directions. It sends it up to our intellectual brain, or what we're calling the intellectual part of the brain. So this is where our intellectual thinking and our executive function happens. And it sends it down to the lower part, which we collectively refer to as the primitive brain. And if you were watching Hannah's presentation earlier, you'll know which bit it gets to faster. It's the primitive brain. And that's why we go into that fight flight response before we even realize what's happening. Now, of course, when the information, like a split second later, gets to the intellectual part of the brain, then our intellectual part can choose to override that stress response if, for example, it turns out that what we actually saw was a snowman or a snow bear and not a polar bear, and we're not really in any danger. However, the more stress that we're already under and the more past experiences we've got that are playing into this mix, then the less able we are to make that rational decision. Now, our brains, over millions of years of evolution, have really not caught up with the modern world that we've created. And so there are lots of things that seem like polar bears to us that aren't really such a great threat, but they can cause us severe anxiety and tip us over into that stress response. So that could be things like having to deliver a presentation to an audience, or your presentation going all wrong on Zoom. Who knew? Giving feedback to an underperforming employee, or receiving your performance review. Could be making a call to a difficult client. Could be dealing with one of those client issues that you come across in ITSM. And as Graham mentioned earlier, parenting can be incredibly stressful. So the hamster is there because this is a true story from my childhood. My parents one night decided to let the pet hamster out to play and it escaped. And so after a sleepless night, a sleepless and very stressful night, they then had to explain to myself and my siblings the next morning that the poor hamster, poor Goldie, had been lost. And our response, oh, well, can we have a gerbil now, please? So let's go back to the brain and take a look at these two areas. So the intellectual brain comprises this prefrontal cortex, which is the bit behind the forehead, and the main cortex. And that's where all of our vast array of intellectual resources reside and where we can access them. Now, if you've ever read a book called The Chimp Paradox, highly recommend it. It's by Professor Steve Peters. And he talks about this part of the brain as being your human part. It's rational, it's logical, it's reasoning. It makes a proper assessment based on basically a proper assessment of the situation and comes up with an appropriate response. And it does tend to be quite positive. So when this part of our brain is in control, we are being the best version of ourselves. Peters does also talk about the computer part, which is where our memories and our beliefs are stored. But for the purposes here, we can just kind of lump that in as part of our intellectual brain. Then we've got the primitive part. And Peters refers to this as our chimp brain because it's emotionally driven, it's impulsive, it has a tendency to throw its toys out of the pram when it doesn't get its own way. It's also quite negatively orientated and it tends to see things from the worst possible perspective. Now, that might seem pretty unhelpful, but its primary purpose, as Hannah alluded to earlier, is to keep us safe. However, it can become overvigilant and a bit obsessional, and we can get stuck in anxiety loops. We've then got an area where is this brain information based on men and women's brains? So there are some excellent books that talk about the difference in wiring, but what I'm explaining is a sufficiently high enough concept that it applies across men and women's brains, yeah. Then we've got this area where we've got sort of three key components sit. We've got the amygdala. So this is about the size and shape of an almond. So it's actually quite tiny. There are two of them. There's one for each hemisphere of the brain, but we tend to refer to it in the singular. And for all of its small size, it's actually very powerful because That is the part that processes emotions, fear, memory, and it's also that part that drives the stress response. It works closely with the hypothalamus and the hippocampus. So the hypothalamus regulates the chemical responses in our body, and the hippocampus is where, for example, our learned habits and behaviors sit. It's also a part of our memory system, which is why, we respond in certain ways to certain events. So let's say we're facing that polar bear. The amygdala, the message has gone to the amygdala. The amygdala has kicked off the stress response. The hypothalamus initiates the production of the adrenaline and the cortisol to boost us into action. And the hippocampus offers up a template of what to do in this situation, typically fight or flee. And our chimp brain is now in full control. And this is all ancient wiring that, as I say, hasn't really caught up with the modern environment, which is why the stress response is still limited to those options, that fight, flight, freeze. They've added lots of other Fs to it, but the main ones really are fight and flight. And that is the response that will kick off even when the stressors we're facing aren't life-threatening. So how come there seems to be so much anxiety and stress around? Well, to be fair, we're actually very good at creating a lot of it for ourselves. So anxiety gets caused by negative thinking. So you might think it's, well, no, surely it's down to the events that are driving the anxiety. That's not strictly true. The event will give a context for the anxiety to occur, but whether that anxiety occurs or how much anxiety occurs, that is very much an individual thing. And that is why two people can have very different responses to the same event. So it's down to our perception of that event, what it means to us, and our thought processes. Anxiety is rarely about the present moment. We typically create it either by ruminating about what's happened in the past or by negatively forecasting future outcomes. Even in the moment, you're negatively forecasting the impact of what's happening, what that's going to mean in the future. And anxiety, by the way, is not a bad thing, okay? When feelings of anxiety bubble up, and we usually feel them somewhere in the body, it's a mechanism to get our attention because something needs dealing with in order to keep us safe, whether that's physically safe or psychologically safe. So we don't want to get rid of it altogether, but we still need to know about the polar bears when they're out there, but we don't necessarily need to be on high alert for all the snowmen or snow bears. It's worth noting that the brain doesn't easily distinguish between reality and imagination, which is why, for example, you can get such an emotional reaction to something that you know isn't true, like a sad story or a scary film. It's also why visualization and mental rehearsal are such powerful tools for performance improvement or for preparing for a particular event. So let's say you've got an event coming up. Let's say you've got an important meeting coming up. It's actually a fairly regular occurrence and normally it goes okay. But for whatever reason, you start playing through in your mind all the things that could go wrong. And let's say you do that 50 times. The meeting happens and it does go well. But as far as your brain is concerned, you've actually attended 51 meetings and 50 of them were disastrous. And every negative thought, every one of those disastrous predictions, that causes anxiety and that gets accumulated and stored in sort of in your brain. And we talk about it being stored in a stress bucket. So that's obviously a metaphor, but it is a really useful concept. Now, you might argue at this point that, well, surely it's quite helpful to be able to play through the things that might happen, the things that could go wrong, so you can prepare for those eventualities. And that's true, but we can take it too far. The world is full of uncertainty, as we know, and what we really need is to have more trust in ourselves that we'll be able to cope. We need to build our tolerance for uncertainty. That's kind of our resilience. And there's a very good book on that subject. It's quite old now. I think I read it about 30 years ago. It's called Feel the Fear and Do It Anyway by Susan Jeffers. And in that, she talks about, feel the fear, do it anyway, and know that you'll handle whatever happens. Okay. So we've got all of this negative forecasting going on, and it's all going into our stress bucket, filling up our stress bucket. And we can imagine that being like rocks. going into our stress bucket. And we keep filling it up and filling it up until it's practically overflowing. Now, how do we empty our stress bucket? Well, fortunately, we have a natural inbuilt mechanism to do that, and that is our REM sleep. So that's REM, stands for rapid eye movement. And that is part of our, we have 4 phases in each sleep cycle, and that's the 4th one where we tend to do our dreaming. So during our REM sleep, we process what's in our stress bucket. And as we're doing that, we're stripping out a lot of that emotion, particularly the negative emotion. We're converting it into what is more of a narrative memory, or we're discarding it altogether if it's something that we don't really need to remember. So how brilliant must it be to wake up in the morning with an empty stress bucket? Because it means you've got capacity to deal with the challenges of the day. That's why it's a bucket, not a plate, right? And you're much more likely to have your intellectual brain being in control. But REM sleep is very energy intensive, and so our brains don't like to overdo it. So there's often, if you've got a very full stress bucket, there's a battle going on at night. You're trying to empty the stress bucket in your REM sleep, and your brain is trying to stop you from overdoing it so that you don't become completely exhausted. What you end up with then, of course, is disrupted sleep. And in the morning, you're starting the day before you've even got out of bed with stuff already in your stress bucket. And the more there is in your bucket, the more vulnerable you are to having your primitive brain hijack the situation and run the show for you. And as we said, that primitive brain is more negatively focused. And so you quickly going into a downward spiral of seeing things from the worst possible perspective and filling up your stress bucket even more. So what is the solution? Well, we've had some great solutions already today. So Sue talked about box breathing. So breathing techniques really helpful. Hannah introduced us to the physiological sigh. I even stole the picture she used. Sue talked about name it to tame it, micro boundaries, writing down your positives, possibly venting, being more proactive, taking a break from social media, giving yourself a break overall. So there's a lot of things that we can do in real time, and the breathing ones are the best in real time. And then there are other things that we can be doing over the longer term, and I'm going to introduce some additional ones for you. And really what I like to focus on with my clients is reducing what goes in your stress bucket so that then you've got a chance to start clearing some of that stuff that's been piling up in there, because stuff can sit there for a very long time. And often when I deal, when I'm working with a client who's got trauma in the past, it's like a real sludge or sediment at the bottom of the bucket that they've never really managed to get around to processing because they're just constantly filling it up with other rocks on top. So I like to kind of use this, another metaphor in a way. And maybe it's because my birthday is in the first half of October and I'm a Libran, I don't know, but I do like a balanced scale. So the idea is that sitting alongside your metaphorical stress bucket is an equally metaphorical feel-good bucket. And so any thought or perception you have about something that you're doing or something that's happening, it can go into one of those buckets, but you can only be putting stuff into one of the buckets at a time. So if you're busy filling up your feel-good bucket, you're not going to be putting quite so much into your stress bucket. That's the idea of that. But what do I mean by feel-good things? So these are really ways of thinking, behaving, interacting that are more positively orientated and that quite simply help to make you feel good. Now, this isn't about having a Pollyanna, everything's rosy, positive view of the world, but it is about tipping those scales a bit more in favour of the positives. Let's take an example of somebody cutting you up on the road. You can get angry, you can lean on the horn, you can swear at them, you can mutter under your breath. All of these things are the kind of things that my husband does. Or you can let it go. You can tell yourself that they didn't see you, or they misjudged what they were doing, or maybe they've got an injured cat on the back seat and they're trying to get to a vet. You don't know. You'll probably never know. So if you're going to make it up, if you're going to mind read, you might as well make it good. And this is what we call reframing. It's about putting a more positive spin on something, particularly in the absence of facts. In Buddhism, there's a saying about the second arrow. So the first arrow is the unfortunate event. So you've shot yourself in the foot with your bow and arrow, or in the case of of our example here, you've been cut up on the road. The second arrow, and that causes basically pain, shooting yourself in the foot, physical pain. Being cut up on the road, you've got that kind of emotional, psychological pain. The second arrow then is when you start swearing and cursing and calling yourself an absolute idiot for shooting yourself in the foot. Or in our case, you put yourself into a bad mood because of what somebody else did. So we don't really want that second arrow. We don't need that second arrow. So I'm a solution-focused hypnotherapist, a little bit different to other types of hypnotherapy and other types of talking therapies, actually. I work holistically with clients to help them improve their ability to respond more positively and effectively to whatever life is throwing at them. So people might come to me to reduce anxiety or stress or overwhelm. I work with burnout, with trauma, addictions, phobias, all kinds of things. There's a comprehensive list on my website if you wanted to have a look. I'll give you the link later. It doesn't really matter what I'm working on with a client, because for all of them, the concept of the stress bucket is key, because we need to reduce what's going into our stress bucket in order to be able to better cope with everything else that's going on in our life. So that is foundational then for the client to be able to move forward and work on whatever it is that they want to address, whatever it is they want to be different. So the key question that I will start a session with is this: what's been good? In other words, what have you been putting into your feel-good bucket since our last session? And what else? And what else? And what was good about that? And how did that make you feel? Okay, so why do I do that? Well, there's a couple of reasons. It helps my client come out of their primitive brain and get into their intellectual brain, where they can access all of those amazing resources, all of that wisdom and creativity. And it gets those feel-good chemicals flowing, the serotonin, the dopamine, the endorphins, and so on. Then we can have a much more productive session as we move into the psychotherapy part. Secondly, it actually trains my client in the habit of noticing the good things, because often we just let them pass us by. And when we're caught up in anxious thinking, then our primitive brain is more in control, and it's looking for those negatives. It's looking for those threats. It's trying to keep us safe. And when we look for the negatives, it's what we find. When we look for the positives, guess what? That's what we start to find. So we've talked about some of the things that we can do that are more positive. As I say, Sue mentioned some of these things. So writing them down, just taking more proactive action, giving yourself a break. And another thing I was reading recently was talking about how a 20-minute stroll outside can help you enter into what's called a flow state. And when you're in this flow state, there are parts of your brain that become switched off, and those are the parts that are involved in rumination and in making plans for the future. So they kind of go offline for a bit. And then because you're walking, you've got a rhythmic movement going on, which then helps to spur some oscillations in the brain, causing brain activity that is known as theta waves, which are deeply relaxing. And that can then improve cognition, memory, and mood. And if you can walk outdoors in green spaces or near water, apparently that is especially restorative. They've done brain scans of people whilst they were looking at landscapes, and they've shown what a calming effect it does actually have. Because nature has a way of gently capturing our attention with minimal effort on our part. And that gives us a really nice, healthy contrast from the constant demands that we have on our attention, particularly in the workplace, obviously, that are actually cognitively draining. So yeah, flow states, one of my favorite moments, absolutely. And even cityscapes, if you're stuck in a city, down the coast, lovely, and having a coffee with it, absolutely. So cityscapes, they're better than staying put in your office or home. And a lot of cities are built with green spaces for that very reason, really. Okay, so the final part of what I do when I work directly with clients is the hypnosis bit. And this seems to be the mysterious part that people are either think it's going to somehow magically do something to them and fix their problems, or maybe they are a little more nervous and are seeing more sinister interpretations that I'm somehow going to take control of their minds. This is simply not true. if hypnotherapists could do that, do you not think we'd be using those superpowers to sort out some of the problems in the world? Hypnosis is simply a relaxed state in which a person is better able to access their intellectual brain and all of those amazing resources. It's really just a guided relaxation that produces a state very similar to what happens when we're daydreaming. So also used at night, when we do this guided relaxation at night, that can be really helpful for sleep. So I always give my clients a free recording that they can listen to when they go to bed. And there's actually a free taster of a guided relaxation recording that you can access via my website, should you so wish to. Okay, so we've talked about anxiety and how it works in the brain. We've looked at the idea of having an intellectual or human part to our brain, which is more rational and positive. We've talked about this primitive or chimp part of the brain, which tends to be more emotional and more negatively biased, but which is focused on keeping us safe. We've looked at how we're quite good at creating or perpetuating states of anxiety for ourselves. And we've talked about some ways of calming those states, particularly if it's not a life or death situation. So calming those states in the moment, in real time, and things we can do to guard against getting so easily into a state of anxiety. One other thing I just wanted to mention is there's a very strong connection, obviously the mind-body connection, but in NLP, we talk about three things. We talk about the thoughts we have, the feelings we have, and the physiology, and all three have an impact on the other. So if you can just change one of them, it can have a knock-on impact on the others. So physiology, for example, we said going for a walk. That can then have a knock-on impact on how you think and how you feel. The way you think about something affects how you feel about it and will affect how you then feel in the body as well as in the mind. So it's an interplay between those three, which if you tweak one of them, you start to impact the others. So if you take nothing else away from what I've said, take these two things: the concept of the stress bucket and having more focus on life's positives, even the little things, because they most definitely add up and fill up your feel-good bucket. So maybe at night when you go to bed, you could write down some things that have been good, or maybe at the dinner table with the family. If you've got a family, ask what's been good. It's really good to get children involved in this. Write down or talk about 3 good things from your day. Get into the habit of doing it, and it can have a really powerful impact on your mood and your ability to enjoy life. And imagine how productive your meetings could be if at the start of a meeting you could spend a few minutes just sharing some what's been goods, getting everyone up into that intellectual brain so that more wisdom and creativity can be generated in the room. So, as I said, I work holistically. My sessions are a combination of psychotherapy and hypnosis with a bit of NLP thrown in as appropriate. And because it's solution focused, it means we don't talk about the problems. This is not the sort of therapy that pulls apart the past looking for root cause and meaning, because we find that you don't need to get into all of that in order to be able to move forward and to deal with it. Because as I said, it's just stuff that's stuck in your stress bucket. My approach helps you to create an environment in which your subconscious can process the issues that are lurking in your stress bucket and in which you can then come up with the best solutions for you. And there's often a collateral fallout from that process as well, from that holistic approach, because a client may come to me for one thing and then suddenly there's a ripple effect through other areas of their life, and almost magically other things resolve. Of course, it's not magic, it's neuroscience. So please do connect with me on LinkedIn, follow me on other socials if you want to, or you can message me directly through any of those platforms. But that is me done for today. So thank you very much for listening.